Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome here to Wine with Jimmy. Thank you so much for clicking by. This is a channel dedicated to all things vinous, all things wine related. So, if you are a budding, enthusiastic wine amateur, then you will find this very useful. And if you are studying the world of wine, such as your WSET, you certainly will find these presentations, videos very, very useful. I am looking here at a video on Australia. This is following key text and key syllabus. The syllabus here is the WSET Diploma. So if you're studying the diploma, this is good for you. So Australia is actually broken into 6 series. I'm looking here at Series 1, the Introduction to Australia. If you have any comments or any questions, please do get in touch. You can do so by commenting on this video below. Maybe you've been to Australia, you'd like to share some recommends, favorite wineries, favorite wine styles, or you have a question about the video, please do get in touch. So this is part 2 of 7, looking at the wine laws and business. So I'll go through here things like geographical indications, labeling, and I'll go through wine business and exports and so on. This is a free video. Part 3 will also be free, but parts 4 through to 7 are available only to those of you who subscribe to my e-learning platform. That's a very, very information-rich platform with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of videos and extra wine resources such as questions and so on. Okay, let's begin by talking about GIs, Geographical Indications. So Australia developed a system of geographical indications throughout the 1990s, splitting its wine regions into a series of zones, regions, and sub-regions. So here we are looking at the zones. I've provided you a map of the zones on the left-hand side and then some key information about the zones on the right-hand side. Zones are the largest areas. There are no rules regarding the drawing of boundaries and no requirements for shared geographic or climate considerations. Zones can cover an entire state, such as South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, or Western Australia, or it can cover multiple states like Southeastern Australia. Most states have been divided into a number of further zones. Examples of these smaller zones, say in South Australia, include Barossa Zone, Mount Lofty Ranges Zone, and the Fleury Zone. These 3 zones also make up the larger Adelaide Super Zone as well. With the exception of Barossa, however, the names of these smaller zones will seldom appear on labels. It's typically the region that is more used due to its fame, its iconic status. So let's talk about those regions. These, therefore, are smaller than zones. 64 have been registered, and examples, you can have many. Margaret River, Clare Valley, McLaren Vale, Coonawarra. So there are many of these. Regions vary in size, but must have consistent and distinct qualities. A region also must usually produce at least 500 tons of grapes a year across at least 5 differently owned vineyards, each of at least 5 hectares large. Please do note that the state of Tasmania is treated as a region rather than a zone. And then the smallest, we have sub-regions. So in some regions, most notably the Hunter Valley and the Great Southern, these sub-regions have been created to recognize areas with particular climates, topography, and geology. Currently, only 14 subregions have been registered, but this hierarchy gives producers a range of labeling options. For example, wine made using grapes in the Eden Valley region could be labeled as Eden Valley, or Barossa, or Adelaide, or South Australia, or Southeastern Australia. Usually, the use of a zone on the label reflects multi-regional blending. Just a few things on these sub-regions here. You'll see the Hunter Valley has 3. You'll see that Southwest Australia's Southern has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they're together, those have 8, which is over half of the sub-regions. A little bit on labelling. The Australian wine labelling is governed by the LIP, Label Integrity Programme. It was first introduced in 1990. Now, under the LIP, if a GI, vintage, or grape variety is mentioned on the label, 85% of the grapes must conform. If multiple varieties are mentioned, they must be listed in descending order of how much they contribute in the blend. So, if it is, say, a GSM, for example, that should have a larger amount of Grenache, then Syrah, then Mataro, or Mourvèdre, as it's otherwise known as. So therefore, the aim of the LIP is to ensure that labels truthfully reflect what is in the bottle. Growers, producers, and suppliers are required to keep detailed records, which are regularly audited by the Australia Grape and Wine Authority, trading as Wine Australia, which oversees the LIP. I've put up here the conditions for the grower guide to the Label Integrity Programme. So talking about why records need to be kept, who should be keeping them, what records should be kept, and an example record you'll see on the right-hand side that you see just there from the Swan Valley, Western Australia. Okay, so moving on. We're now going to talk about a slight anomaly in terms of a large area, and this is the Southeastern Australian region. So later in previous presentations, I'll talk about key zones and regions and even sub-regions. But we're going to talk about the expansive area of Southeastern Australia just here on this presentation. So this is a vast zone covering the whole of Victoria, New South Wales, and Tasmania, along with the southeastern corners of South Australia and also Queensland. Now, this was created to allow blending from grapes grown across the zone, and the majority of wines labelled as such, so Southeast Australia, are inexpensive and relatively high volume. This certainly accounts for the commercial side of the Australian wine industry. To give you a point of reference, we know that Australia as a landmass is larger than Europe. So you really are taking a swathe of, say, something like Western Europe with this same sort of land mass down here that's highlighted on your map for Southeastern Australia. So it's kind of like saying a wine of Western Europe as an equivalent in Europe. Now, most of the grapes used in these wines come from the Murray-Darling Basin. That's an area covering around 1 million kilometres squared. That's about 400,000 square miles. And it's formed by the rivers Murray and the Darling, plus all of the smaller rivers that flow into its watershed. So, what are the main regions for Southeastern Australian wine? The 3 main wine producing regions within the basin are what I've highlighted here. There's many in this box, but this is roughly where we find them. But I put them as a list on the right-hand side. So this is Riverland. That's along the Murray River in South Australia. the Murray-Darling, which is an area along both rivers which falls within both Victoria and New South Wales, and then Riverina on the Murrumbidgee River. That's a major tributary along the Murray River in New South Wales, so closer to the Great Dividing Range. Riverland is the lower Murray zone, and Murray-Darling and Riverina are in the Big Rivers zone. These are comfortably Australia's three largest wine producing regions, certainly in terms of vineyard area and production. So, what's the climate here? Pretty much hot and continental, though the rivers, which we extensively just talked about can actually provide a slight cooling influence. And despite being around 200 kilometres inland, Riverland is a little less hot as it benefits from a slight maritime influence, as there are no mountains between the Riverland area and the coast, the Southern Ocean. Now, these large regions provide ideal conditions for consistently producing high yields, certainly high yields of very healthy grapes. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Great Dividing Range. So I've got a picture here of the Riverland area with the Great Dividing Range in the background. So these big three zones, which really produce most of southeastern Australia, will lie to the west of this Great Dividing Range. There's the Murrumbidgee River that we talked about that runs into the Murray. So this is the Great Dividing Range. So if we go to the east here, there's more land. I've just cut it off here. There's more land, but this eventually heads towards the Pacific. So anything to the west here is in the rain shadow of this Great Dividing Range. So rainfall is very low. It's as little as 135 millimeters per growing season in Riverland. Now this, along with predominantly sandy soils, means that irrigation is essential. Sand is very free draining. So water is logically provided by the rivers, but during the difficult climatic change, including a huge volume of droughts, the river levels have fallen alarmingly low in some places. So water prices have significantly increased. Coupled with falling grape prices, this has pushed a lot of grape growers out of business. What grape varieties do we find in Southeast Australia? The major ones are here on your slide, so Shiraz, Chardonnay, as well as Semillon, specifically in Riverina. Now, most of these wines made from certainly Chardonnay, often blended with Semillon, and Shiraz, often blended with Cabernet, tend to be medium-bodied wines, high in alcohol, relatively low in acidity, and characterized by nice fruit flavors. Depending on the desired price point, producers may blend in grapes from other regions to give slightly more flavor, balance, and complexity. There are some significant key brands here. Some of Australia's biggest producers have bases in these regions, including Casella Family Brands, which produces the bottle that's on your left-hand side. Yellowtail, and also Di Bartoli in Riverina, Australian Vintage in Riverland, and Lindemans, who are part of the Treasury Wine Estates based in Murray-Darling. However, there are some higher quality wines emerging from here. Notably, they will be better in balance, with more complex Shiraz and Chardonnay from lower yielding vineyards, and also wines from varieties better suited to the hot climate. So look out for Petit Verdot, Viognier, Italian varieties such as Nero d'Avola, Montepulciano, and Vermentino. The area around Griffith in Riverina has a long established reputation for producing sweet botrytized wine, and specifically from Semillon. Although the weather here is dry and hot in summer, the autumn here, due to its location very close to the Great Dividing Range, brings greater rainfall and humidity. You'll find morning mists and afternoons that are still very warm and sunny, which is ideal as a combination for noble rot. These higher quality wines tend to be labelled with individual regions rather than Southeast Australia. So it will say on the label Griffith Riverina, for example. Now, a little bit about the wine business, just a few slides here. In 2018, there were around 2,250 wineries or vineyards with a brand in Australia. This figure has fallen from about 2,500 in the early 2010s. And that's because really the smaller wineries stopping production and becoming grape growers instead. Despite this, small producers are still the norm. And remember, this is across Australia as a whole. Nearly 80% of producers crushed 250 tonnes of grapes or less in 2018. Conversely, 12 producers crushed over 20,000 tonnes. Many small growers have contracts to sell their grapes to the larger companies. And production volumes are certainly dominated by 5 companies. We've heard some of these before. So certainly Australian Vintage, Treasury Wine Estates, Casella family brands, but then also Accolade Wines and Pernod Ricard. These 5 companies also account for around 87% of all exports. That is a whopping number. Wine Australia is the Australian government authority that funds and coordinates research and development, very much valuable to the wine industry, with income partly derived from a levy on grape growers. It also controls the export of wine from Australia and promotes Australian wine through marketing and educational activities in the domestic, but actually really successfully in the export markets. Its key aims are to increase the demand for, competitiveness of, and quality image of Australian wines. So, from a base of almost zero in the 1980s, Australia is now the 5th largest wine exporter in the whole world. In the last 5 years, exports have ranged from around 7 to 8.6 million hectolitres. And I've actually given you some of the figures here. So we are talking about, so this is 7 millions. So total wine here at the top, 7, 6.9, 7, 7.4, 7.5, 8.1, 8.5, 7.4, 7.4, 6.2, 6.2 million hectolitres. It accounts for around 2/3 of the average annual production that have been exported. And the top markets you'll see there in wonderful flag form. So we have the United Kingdom, China, the United States of America, Canada, and Germany. China has been Australia's fastest growing export market for over 5 years, and it now leads in terms of sales value, although volume sales have decreased in the year 2018 and 19. The value continued to rise by about 18%. Why? Well, the growth has been helped by the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which reduced tariffs and now allows exporters to ship wine directly to mainland China instead of to Hong Kong first. However, Australian wine exports to China dropped suddenly and dramatically during 2020 when China imposed high tariffs on Australian wine as a part of a trade dispute. Those bans were finally receded in 2024. So 4 years have caused, of course, a bit of a stop of those exports. And just a mention on domestic sales. Now, sales of Australian wine in the domestic market have risen slowly in the recent 2 decades. Cellar doors, so the wineries that will sell at the cellar door, are very important, particularly the smaller wineries. Over two-thirds of Australian wine businesses have a cellar door, with the percentage ranging from just over 50% in South Australia to around 70 to 80% for Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, and Tasmania, with all of those having a much greater volume of smaller producers. Wine tourism is well established in many of the regions. It's been a very key driver for growth, raising the profile of the individual wine region, but also providing producers the benefits of increased margins and immediate payments that come with direct to consumer sales. Wine tourism has been successful certainly near the big cities such as Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide. However, even more isolated regions such as the Margaret River have been able to really attract good tourism. Producer websites also have online shops for direct to consumer trade sales. And on the domestic market, wines made from the less common varieties have proven particularly popular in recent years, encouraging producers to experiment with new plantations. However, they can be a little bit more challenging to sell on the export markets as a result of the quite high prices and competition from wines from where those varieties are native to. Okay, well, that brings me to a conclusion for part 2, another rather large video. Please do join me for the next free installment talking about climate and geology. If you do have any comments or questions, then please do get in touch. You can do so by commenting on this video below. But until next time, I've been Jimmy Smith, and if you do find yourself in the UK, come and say hello for a glass, or bottle. Ciao for now. Goodbye.